I'm not doing so well.
I shouldn't do that.
I should know better.
I should be
I'm not
able
good
to do
enough.
that.
I suck at that.
I feel like
Come
I
on.
can't do
Keep
anything.
going.
I never learn.
Don't complain, just push through.
Why did you do that like this again?
Others can do it, why can't I?
You're only allowed to relax once everything is done.
Why am I so
Why can
dumb?
I not
I'm
do
so
it?
stupid.
Don't be such a baby.
I know I should rest more.
Idiot. In all my case studies, no matter how different the people were, or how different the reasons they came to yoga therapy were, there was one thing they all had in common. They tended to treat others with more kindness than they treated themselves. Many of my clients were harsh and critical towards themselves. They held themselves to very high standards, and when they felt they did something wrong, they would berate themselves. They would call themselves names and push themselves to do better. If we work from the assumption that the brain and body believe what we tell them, then being harsh on ourselves and constantly pushing will influence how we feel, both emotionally and physically. And when I saw this in all my clients, the question that came up was, can we use the tools that we have in yoga therapy to change how we speak to ourselves? And if that shifts, can this then promote a greater sense of well-being? To explore this question, I looked at existing research on the way we speak to ourselves and its effects. I work with my clients in yoga therapy sessions on awareness, and I asked them to fill out a survey after they finished the 7 meetings for the case studies. You will find the citations and, where possible, also the links to the research that I have used for my project in the description of this video. I will also add a few links to the books that helped fuel the fire of my interest in this topic. Research shows that self-compassion is not a fixed trait. It's something that can be learned and can be practiced. In a pilot study and a randomized controlled trial, Neff and Germer examined the Mindful Self-Compassion program, and they found significant increases in self-compassion following training. These changes were also found to be maintained at follow-up, suggesting that self-compassion can be cultivated over time rather than being a stable personality characteristic. Research by Ethan Cross and colleagues highlights the role of self-talk in emotional functioning. Their work describes self-talk as an emotion regulation mechanism, meaning that the way people speak to themselves actively influences how emotions are experienced and managed. Self-talk is therefore not neutral background noise. It's a process that can shape stress responses, motivation, and behavior depending on its tone and its content. Other research helps explain how certain patterns of inner dialogue might affect the body. Boschot, Guerin, and Thayer describe what they call the perseverative cognition hypothesis. This theory suggests that repetitive negative thinking, such as worry, rumination, or self-criticism, can prolong physiological stress response, even when no immediate external stressor is present. In this model, the stress response remains active because the mind continues to return to the same internal themes. From a nervous system perspective, which is a big part of what we work with in yoga therapy sessions, prolonged stress responses are associated with reduced access to parasympathetic activity, which supports rest, recovery, and repair. When stress-related activation persists, the body may have difficulty shifting into states associated with safety and rest, even outside of demanding situations. Paul Gilbert's research further distinguishes between different inner styles of self-relating. His work shows that self-criticism is associated with higher levels of psychological distress, while self-reassurance is linked to greater emotional resilience. This distinction highlights that it is not only awareness of the inner dialogue that matters, but it's also the quality and the tone of that dialogue. Neuroscience research adds another layer to this understanding. Klimecki and colleagues studied compassion training, and they found changes in brain activity related to emotion processing and positive affect. Their findings suggest that compassion-based practices are associated with functional neuroplasticity, indicating that changes in emotional relating can be reflected at a neurological level. And finally, research by Arch and colleagues shows that self-compassion training can influence how the body responds to stress. In their studies, participants who received self-compassion training showed changes in physiological stress responses during stressful or socially evaluative tasks. These findings suggest an association between self-compassion practices and changes in autonomic nervous system activity during stress. Taken together, this body of research suggests that self-compassion is trainable, that self-talk plays an active role in emotional regulation, and that persistent self-critical or repetitive inner patterns are associated with prolonged stress responses in both psychological and physiological systems. The challenge in this project is that self-talk is a highly personal and subjective experience. It doesn't always show up clearly in numbers or questionnaires, and what people report is shaped by how they notice, interpret, and communicate their inner experience. Throughout this project, I stayed aware of these limits. I didn't assume that yoga therapy automatically causes changes in self-talk, especially knowing that some clients were also engaged in other forms of support alongside yoga therapy. I remained careful in drawing conclusions, particularly when working with personal experiences and self-reported changes. In yoga therapy, we work with the whole person. And one of the approaches used in the sessions in this project is the Panchamaya Kosha model. The word kosha means sheath or layer. And the idea is that we are not just a physical body or just thoughts or just our emotions, but we are a combination of layers that all influence each other. The first layer is the physical body. Muscles, joints, mechanics, and basic sensations happen in this first layer. The second layer is the breath and the energy layer. How we breathe, how energized or depleted we feel. The third layer relates to the mind. Thoughts, emotions, self-talk, and patterns of reaction. The fourth layer is connected to deeper feeling, to meaning, values, and inner resources like trust or compassion. The fifth layer points towards a sense of self that exists underneath symptoms and stories. It refers to an underlying steadiness or sense of wholeness that can be present even when things are difficult. In yoga therapy sessions, these layers are not treated separately. When we work with the body, the breath responds. When we work with breath or awareness, thoughts and self-talk can shift. The kosha model helps guide my choices as a therapist, and it reminds me to meet clients where access feels possible without forcing change in any specific layer. The sessions in this project followed a consistent structure while remaining responsive to each individual. The case studies included an intake, a physical and breath inquiry, and 5 yoga therapy sessions. Within that structure, the content of each session was adapted to meet the client where they were on that day. Most sessions included a combination of movement, breath awareness, rest, and meditation. All sessions began with a conversation, allowing space to notice how the client arrived and what felt most relevant at that moment. This conversation also helped guide the focus of the session. The session would end with conversation again, with space to talk about what the client experienced in the session and to offer a moment of transition before leaving the practice. Movement practices were gentle and exploratory, aimed at increasing awareness rather than achieving specific physical goals. Breath awareness was used to support noticing patterns of effort, holding, or ease without imposing a particular way of breathing. Most clients thought that they should move and breathe a certain way, and they stated that they knew that they were doing it wrong. Periods of rest or stillness were included to allow the body and the nervous system time to settle. Meditation, guided awareness, and yoga nidra practices were used selectively and adapted to the client's capacity and comfort. Within these practices, positive affirmations or short mantra were sometimes introduced. These were offered invitationally, often during meditative or restful moments, and were framed as phrases to listen to, repeat, or simply notice, rather than as statements that needed to be believed or adopted. Clients were also always given the option to change the phrase to something that they felt was a better fit. Throughout the sessions, choice and permission were emphasized. Practices, including the use of affirmations or mantra, were adjusted or omitted based on physical, emotional, or energetic responses. All sessions were informed by yoga therapy principles and adjusted to respect medical and psychological considerations and contraindications. Rather than following a fixed protocol, the sessions were shaped by ongoing observation, conversation, and responsiveness to the client's experience. What I saw and heard during sessions is what first drew my attention to this subject. Repeated patterns in language, behavior, and physical presence stood out to me as the therapist in the room, and noticing these patterns is what inspired me to choose self-talk as the focus of this project. As early as the intake, increased awareness around self-talk often seemed to have an immediate effect. During conversations, clients would say things like, "I know it's stupid, but," or "I know I should take better care of myself." And these statements were offered spontaneously as part of how clients described their experiences. Do you remember this?
I'm not doing so
shouldn't
I
well.
should
do
know
that.
better.
I'm not good
I
enough
should
to
I
be
do
able
this.
suck at
to do that. I
that.
feel like
I'm
I
so
can't
Feel
do
like you're not
stupid.
anything.
I never
anything.
learned.
going.
Don't complain.
Don't
Just
complain.
push
Just
through
push
it.
Why
Why
through.
did you
can't
You're
do
only
that like
allowed
this
to
Why
You're
now?
again?
such a
milestone
I
once
baby.
know
everything
I
Why
is
should
can I
done.
rest
not do
more.
it?
Idiot. These were all phrases that were either said during sessions or clients gave as examples of what they would say to themselves. When clients were met with normalization and permission, such as hearing that it's okay to be human, to not have all the answers, or to rest and take a break, I often observed a visible softening. This showed up in posture, facial expression, and overall appearance, rather than being something clients explicitly named. The conversations at the beginning and end of each session played an important role. They created space for clients to speak freely and to be heard without judgment. These moments allowed me to listen for how clients spoke about themselves and to reflect back what I heard. I often mirrored back specific phrases or moments, especially positive steps that clients tended to move past quickly. And at times this meant slowing the conversation down and naming these moments together. Occasionally, this also meant taking a moment to acknowledge or celebrate them. Posting with a piece of chocolate or doing a little happy dance is something that would happen quite often in moments like that. To better understand how clients experienced changes in self-talk and self-compassion over time, I asked the participants in my case studies to fill out a short survey. These were filled out recently, so for some of my clients, it was quite a while ago that they were in the case studies, and others had recently finished the 7th session. This survey focused on how they spoke to themselves, how they treated themselves, and whether anything had shifted during or after yoga therapy. What I'll share next is a combination of multiple choice results and participants' own written reflections. Together, they will give a clearer picture of common patterns as well as the range of individual experiences. Before starting yoga therapy, all participants described their self-talk as critical rather than kind. Almost 80% described it as harsh or critical some of the time, and remaining participants described it as harsh most or all of the time. No one described their self-talk as neutral or kind at the start of the process. After starting yoga therapy, nearly 80% of participants reported an increase in awareness of how they speak to themselves. The remaining participants were not sure, often describing it as a gradual or ongoing process rather than a clear shift. No participants reported becoming less aware. When asked how they treated themselves before yoga therapy, most participants described a pattern of strictness rather than care. Over 85% described themselves as harsh or strict, either sometimes or often. Only 2 participants described any form of kindness towards themselves, and none described it as their usual way of being. After starting yoga therapy, nearly 90% of participants reported increased awareness of how they treat themselves. Several participants described noticing earlier when they were pushing themselves beyond their limits or ignoring signals of fatigue or stress. When asked directly whether anything had changed, almost all participants reported a change in both how they speak to themselves and how they treat themselves. Importantly, this does not mean the self-talk became permanently kind or that difficult moments disappeared. Many participants described change as becoming softer, more aware, or less automatic rather than completely different. Participants were then asked to rank the elements of yoga therapy in order of how effective they felt they were. Movement ranked as the most effective element overall, closely followed by conversation. Breath, rest, and meditation were experienced as supportive elements, often helping participants pause or regulate in daily life. Practical tools and recordings were generally described as helpful additions rather than the primary source of change. These rankings reflect perceived effectiveness, not how often each element was used. Looking across the open responses, several shared patterns stood out. Before yoga therapy, over 70% of participants described pushing through pain, fatigue, or emotional overwhelm, often accompanied by guilt around rest. After starting yoga therapy, many described learning to pause instead of push, using breath or small physical practices in daily life. At the same time, about half of the participants described still struggling to access self-compassion in acute moments of stress, illness, or emotional intensity. This suggests that change was experienced as a process rather than a fixed outcome. The survey findings suggest that yoga therapy was associated with increased awareness, softer self-talk, and more supportive ways of treating themselves for most participants. It also indicated that changes in self-talk and self-compassion developed gradually and were context-dependent. What clients expressed spontaneously in our sessions aligns with how they later described their internal dialogue in the surveys. The patterns observed during the sessions are reflected clearly in the survey results. When these observations and reports are viewed alongside existing research on self-talk, self-compassion, and stress regulation, they point toward a consistent relationship between yoga therapy sessions and changes in awareness, self-talk, and daily behavior. At the same time, many participants were also engaged in other forms of support, such as therapy, counseling, or voice work. Self-talk and self-compassion were also described as developing gradually and remaining context-dependent, with some situations making these changes more accessible than others. It's not possible to determine which changes were a direct result of yoga therapy alone. The conclusions here are therefore based on what participants reported and are interpreted with care within the limits of self-reported experience. These findings suggest that yoga therapy can be applied with clients who experience harsh self-talk, high internal pressure, difficulty resting, or a tendency to push through discomfort. In the sessions described in this project, work took place across multiple layers using conversation, movement, breathwork, rest, and meditation. Conversation and movement were experienced as having a big impact on awareness on self-talk and self-treatment. Tools acquired in sessions, such as breath practices, rest, and meditation, were often used in daily life to create space for that awareness. Clients described that changes in self talk often emerged alongside changes in how they moved, breathed, rested, and allowed themselves to slow down. The research question was whether the tools used in yoga therapy can influence how people speak to themselves and whether this can promote a greater sense of well being. Based on the case studies and questionnaires in this project, the answer is yes. Participants reported increased awareness of self talk, a kinder tone in how they speak to themselves, and changes in daily behavior that positively affected their well being. Future research could include additional participants and longer follow up periods to explore how these changes develop over time. Several clients described this as an ongoing process, with phases where changes felt more accessible and phases where it felt more difficult to sustain. Further research into how continuous or longer term support might be offered across these fluctuations could be valuable.
Breathe first.
I am awesome.
Listen to your body.
Take a
I
moment.
don't have to do anything.
I could relax without feeling guilty.
I'm allowed
I
to
don't have to
rest.
push.
I was allowed to slow
There
down.
was space.
I could take it easier.
I am enough.